We are very happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. We always see like MIT, like, the best and the cool. So I'm really happy to be here. So I'm very informal. So I'm going to talk, but anytime you want to stop me for a question, please feel free. So I'm going to tell you, this is really my work as part of my, really my research interests now for quite some time in the intersection of data science and their pollution policy. So I'll tell you about like a huge study, actually the largest ever been conducted on health effects of air pollution. It was 480 million person years. And then what's important is I'm going to go a little bit more, having a deep dive into what are the data science challenges with analyzing such a large amount of data. But also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the political situation that we are right now, and being a little bit provocative in terms of telling you what's happening with the Trump administration in the area of data and science and environmental policy. So I already asked to have some of my slides deleted, so it's not going to be on the video. So, at the very least, I hope to keep you awake. So, so this is President Nixon in 1970 signing the Clean Air Act. And actually, among all of you that are working in the field of data science and social science, actually, let me tell you something, that President Nixon was a data scientist. This was like, really? Well, the Clean Air Act was actually a data science policy. It has been very, very successful, because what the Clean Air Act said is, guess what? Look at the data, and if the data are telling us that the level of air pollution are harmful to human health, we need to implement more stringent policy, and we need to clean up the air. And I don't need to convince you that when you do things where you look at the data, actually works, right? So these have been the ambient level of air pollution in the United States in the last 20 years. This horizontal line are the national ambient air quality standards. It's like the safe level. And then it is how the level of the different pollutants, the criteria pollutant, have been going down. So actually, you see all over the news, if you look at a photograph of Los Angeles or Southern California in the 70s and now, it's literally, black and blue, right? So we have been able to clean up the air quite a lot thanks to the Clean Air Act, really a data science law. Now, the current political climate is a little different right now. These are just also the headline. I'm sure you all know that actually there is an attempt to, instead of moving forward, moving backward, and where science and data science are playing a less and less important role. So I want to tell you my own journey in the last few years in terms of, especially with the current administration, how you take data science at the highest level to inform regulatory policy. We had two specific questions, very, very targeted. One is, if you breathe the levels of pollution, they are below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, which are the safety standard, do we see an increase in mortality risk, right? If the answer to that question is yes, because of President Nixon, our friend data scientist President Nixon, we have to lower the standard, right? We have to implement more stringent regulation to clean up the air. And then, of course, we're really important to figure out who is more at risk. Now, right now, in the United States, as a way of background, there are two standards for fine particulate matter. One is the daily standard, which is 35 microgram per cubic meter. So these are like fluctuation within 24 hours. And then there are the annual standard, which is 12 microgram per cubic meter. Most of what I'm going to talk about is about 12 microgram per cubic meter. So basically, if you live in areas in the United States, I'll tell you which there are in a second, where you always breathe pollution levels below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, below 12, do we see an increase in mortality risk associated with pollution? And if the answer is yes, by the Clean Air Act, we have to clean up the air even further. So to address this question, the other thing I've always been very passionate since when I really started my career is building large data platform. if you want to get a transformative impact in society, the first thing you have to do is get a ton of data and get a good data. Well, this is not perfect data, but it's all the data that we have available. So my lab and my team, and by the way, if you're interested to collaborate with us, this is always possible. Just drop me an email, it will make it happen. We have collected, for most of this data, by the way, are publicly available, comes from all different types of government data sources. It just is really messy for you to go and get it one at a time, so we have done the work for you. So we took all of their pollution data, all of the power plant data, all of the traffic data, all of the weather data, and then we buy claims data from Medicare and Medicaid services. So we have a data user agreement, but we can let students work with the data. And then we have all kinds. So if you want to look at the health effects of pollution, you have to figure out the confounders, right? Which are the other variables that could be increasing the risk of mortality, but they are not pollution. So socioeconomic status and poverty and other types of variables. So I like data. I like data platform. The other thing you will realize for this talk, I like quotes. And so I think when I look at the Marilyn Monroe quotes, is that given girl the right shoes, data I meant, she can conquer the world. Actually, for me, being Italian, I need both nice shoes and the data, and I think I can conquer the world. So that's the data. It's huge because I'll tell you in a second. So we had, like, when we buy this claims data, we buy all the claims data. So it's 97% of the population older than 65. They are linked longitudinally now for 20 years, and we have up to 67 million people that we can track over time for all of their hospitalization. We have mortality, cause-specific hospitalization, and some other individual level information. So the data for the study I'm going to tell you is up to 2012, but now we have updated the data up to 2017. And so the idea is, for the claims data, it's simple. Every year, everyone in the United States, well, not everyone, but everyone who is eligible, which is the great majority, when they turn 65, they enter into Medicare. So as soon as they enter Medicare, we know where people live, we know their age, gender, race, and we know every time they get hospitalized for which disease, and we know when they died. And so we can follow them over time, and now from 2000, now we have to 2017. And so that is just the map of all the data. And so if you start linking at them longitudinally, is actually 480 million person year, I forgot the million. And then we did the same thing with Medicaid claims. So that I have like a large team that are like managing this data, linking the data. Medicaid population is a different population, as you might know. Different states have different eligibility to get into Medicaid. So it will provide you health insurance for people low socioeconomic status. The nice thing about Medicaid is that it's all ages. So we can study people that are also younger than 65. And then we link to the air pollution monitoring network from the EPA. This is public available data. So these are the monitor stations that are maintained by the Environmental Protection Agency, and they measure daily levels of air pollution. Now, the first data science challenge that we want to overcome, and we try to overcome, but that's an area where more people work, the better it is for society, is that, as you can see from this map, there are areas where are not monitored very well. Right? Now, Medicaid and Medicare files are available everywhere, right? So one thing I can do is I say, well, I'm just going to do a study. I'm going to just study people that are close to the monitors. Or I can say, well, I can use a ton of additional data, do a major prediction machine learning approach, and try to predict exposure to pollution also in the area that are not monitored, right? And so that's through my colleagues in a collaboration. This is just a cartoon, but basically what we did is we took satellite data. Satellite data is great, come from NASA, they are free, and they measure aerosol optical depth. They are like an imprecise measure of pollution. By themselves, they cannot be used for exposure, but it's a good proxy. Then we take weather data, then we take output of atmospheric chemistry model, then we take land use data. We took all of the data you can imagine, and then we put it into, and then of course we take all of their pollution monitoring data, then we put it into a neural net, and then we predict daily 1 kilometer to 1 kilometer levels of PM2.5. So that will allow us to predict and estimate air pollution levels in areas that are not monitored with a great deal of accuracy. It's not perfect, but it's better not to have it. So that's the full map. That is on average. And then 2 years ago, well, approximately 2 years ago, we published this paper, which is basically that allow us to conduct the largest to date study on air pollution and mortality, because we have had the entire population of the United States older than 65. We could predict how much pollution they breathe for every 1 kilometer to 1 kilometer grid. We can really zoom in on the people that breathe low level of pollution and calculate whether or not there was an increased risk in mortality for the cleanest area. So this is just like the summary table, and I want to focus your attention on this, because remember, the question I was really interested, back to the Clean Air Act, is if I take people that are living in an area that have levels of pollution below 12 micrograms per cubic meter, do we see a mortality risk, an increase in mortality risk among them? And so we have the enormous number of people now, because we have 32 million people that are living in clean area, and 11 million deaths. And that was really the population I was interested in particular. And then, very quickly, these are just standard, but, huge, massive amount of data and analyzing it in a very standardized way. So basically, if you look at these results, these are odds ratio. So the main analysis is basically including everybody. And the bottom line is what we found is for 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM2.5, we have a 7.3% increase in mortality risk. Very importantly, this number, this is called the low exposure analysis. What this number means is that if I only look at people that live in the United States and breathe levels of pollution below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, the mortality risk is actually higher, it's 13%. And this is an estimate where I said, well, I don't trust at all my neural net machine learning stuff, and I'm only going to do the analysis for people that live close to a monitor, just to make sure that this was not doing to model data and the results is still there. So this is huge. I mean, it's huge in terms not only of the size of the fact, but it's huge from a policy and political reason. And so, I'll get that in a second. We also did an analysis by looking at different groups of the population. We have Black having a much higher risk of mortality associated with air pollution, and also people that are lower socioeconomic status that are eligible for Medicaid have higher risk. So that's where actually the fun begins. So what I was going to say is that this study had a huge impact, and it was covered all over the news. It still covers all the news, and of course is now under a lot of scrutiny, correctly so. It should be under scrutiny because it's the largest study today to show that current level of pollution are harmful in the United States, and so we need to implement a more stringent regulation that costs a lot of money, and they are not consistent with the current political agenda. We had Senator Cory Booker actually using the study to appoint some of the Trump nominee for the Environmental Protection Agency. Alexandra Ocasio was also using the study to try to get against the political agenda. The other thing I think in the world of data science, and that's how I see it, is that I think that the entire world of data science, a big chunk of the world of data science, is how you inform causality from messy observational data, right? So as a statistician, I was trained as a statistician. I'm still a statistician. We were trained about this concept, right? You have an hypothesis, you randomize, you have an experiment, you test the hypothesis, and you look at the power of the test, right? Well, forget that. We are not in that world anymore, right? Well, okay. Maybe some of you, if you're doing rats and biological experiments, and some experiment you do, but in the world of data science, you are here, right? You are now the control group. We are bombarded with data coming from all the places, from different places. And this study has been conducted is a classical example. There is not a single government data sources I've not been using for doing my air pollution data, right? And they're coming from all different types of places. What I do, I try to do causality, right, out of that data. And so this is also a little bit about joke, is that, is there anything that we control about inference in today's world? Now, data science can also be manipulated for the evil. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story that this happened last week, by the way. So the new chair of the Clean Air Act Advisory Committee, this is the highest level scientific committee that advises the Environmental Protection Agency about whether or not lower the level of pollution. This used to be a committee of 20 scientists, including a lot of statisticians and epidemiologists. That committee was fired, and then they appointed the new chair of the committee. The name is Tony Cox, and he is a former consultant for the oil industry. Now, what Tony Cox does, he's very smart because he knows the law about the new area of data science and the new area of causality. And he brought forward this argument that if we wanted to regulate air pollution, we cannot look at simply extracting information from observational data, but you have to prove what he called manipulative causation. This is the terms that he comes with it. And this is very dangerous because it's kind of like twisting data science rigor. Of course, from observational data, you want to do your best to approximate a randomized experiment and try to infer causality, right? But you know that from observational data, you're never going to have an absolute proof of causality. And what he has been moving forward, and this, again, this is happened last week, was this topic of causality. Unless you prove causality, which I don't know what does it mean, you cannot implement regulation. So we had a commentary in Science published on March 22nd that explained what does it mean extracting causality or making statement about causality for analysis of observational data. Now, this commentary was coming up purposely on March 22nd because on March 28th, there was a public hearing where whether or not his position would be a good position, right? And I'm going to turn back to that later. So I think as a data scientist, and when you're thinking about being a data scientist and doing important things in society, we are now having a more and more prominent role, not only to do the right thing, but also educating about misinformation and twisting ideas about data science that sounds good, but that are not really attainable. So with my colleague, Corey Ziegler, we have done a lot of causal methodology in analysis of observational data. And this is nothing new. I mean, if you have any training and you do causal inference, you immediately understand that in order from observational data to make a statement about causality is really about the design. You wanted to basically do your best that you can to approximate the observational study as a randomized study. You want to define the counterfactual, and then you wanted to estimate the unobserved counterfactual using a well-defined control population. I mean, all of these guiding principles are actually very hard. It's really hard to do causal inference from messy observational data. But this is the type, and there is not the magic bullet, right? There is not the perfect statistical method that will give you evidence of causality. And so anyway, I think many of you might be familiar with causal inference, but what I was trying to explain is that in the context of air pollution, I mean, the general idea about causality really goes back to the idea of matching, right? So you have an area, Portage, Wisconsin, that is exposed to low level of pollution, and you have an area, Steubenville, Ohio, that breathe a lot of pollution. And then what you're trying to say is that, well, Jane is a woman that lives in Steubenville, Ohio. I wanted to figure out all of the counterfactual, the women that are similar as possible to Jane, right? The only difference between this group of women and Jane is that they breathing lower level of pollution, right? And so that's the idea about matching, about the counterfactual, about all of the uncertainty associated with that. But doesn't exist this idea that there's going to be one bulletproof that, these effects are causal. And so this is very hard. One other challenge is I wanted to show these slides because actually Maggie is a PhD student here at MIT, and she worked with me on the study before getting to the MIT. So I hope as soon as she graduates, I'm going to hire her back. But we did actually one other big criticism, and I can go pretty fast on this, but one big criticism about everything we have been doing is that we don't use individual level smoking data. So they were saying, well, everything that you have is actually invalid because you are not measuring smoking. And you can measure smoking on 60 million people. So with Maggie and Joy in my team, this was a simple analysis but very powerful where in the context of unmeasured confounding, clearly you can do sensitivity analysis to unmeasured confounding. But actually here we were able to do something really better because we took a sub-cohort of the Medicare cohort, it's called Medicare Cohort Beneficiary Survey, where they measure smoking. And then we rerun the analysis using all of the variables, including smoking, body mass index, there were 120 variables, and then doing the analysis on the same identical population and using only the variable that were measured by Medicare, results didn't change, right? Results were exactly right there, which actually, what tells actually us is that the most important confounders, when you account for age, gender, and race, the most important confounder actually at the neighbor level, or the socioeconomic status level, the zip code level, and not much really this, smoking or body mass index and things like that. Now, another important analysis that, I'm just going to go through the animation, is really, I know that you had Susan Haiti coming to give a talk in the past, and there is this entire field of causal inference in terms of understanding treatment effect heterogeneity. And so this was actually Konsang Lee. He was a student on Dylan Small and Paul Rosenbaum at UPenn. And so what we have been doing, this is like more methodologically driven causal inference, where basically what we do is, so our goal is to identify the de novo, without any hypothesis, identify the novel subgroup of the population that have a higher causal effect of pollution than the average. Okay, that's the goal. Instead of saying, are older people more vulnerable, can we have the data discover that? And so what we did is, Konsang lead that work, develop a new approach, which is basically first does exact matching, right? So you take people exposed to high pollution level and low pollution level, then first you exactly match as many as covariates that you can. In this way, you try to control for measured confounding bias. Then we did honest inference, where we split the sample. And one of the sample is basically we throw out a causal tree or regression tree, and then we discover, so the regression tree identified some of these groups that have pollution level, the health effects of pollution higher than the average. And then we did randomization-based inference, which doesn't rely on any parametric assumption, to identify which of the subgroup were statistical significant higher or lower than the average. And so basically what you see is that this was a subset of the data, but the very, very, very old have much larger effect, and also the older, but they were both old and also Medicaid eligible and so on. And then on the other hand, you have that the white people and the younger people tend to have a lower effect. Now this one, another important area of research, right? There's so much more to do here. One is when you discover the tree, we didn't propagate it, when we do the testing, we didn't propagate the uncertainty in discovering the tree into the testing, right? So that's really important. Two, this is not very scalable computationally, because here I just did like, okay, age, gender, race, and Medicaid eligible, not particularly exciting. If you have a large number of variables, how you scale that. So that is also an area that we're really working really hard to generalize. Here is another area of causal inference that I'm really excited. And by the way, I put pictures of people that do all the work that were my former or current PhD student and postdoctoral fellow. And also I put the link to the paper or the archive, and you can always email me. I'm happy to share it with you. So here is another question. So again, the policy question is, are low level of pollution harmful? All right? So what we really want to do, we wanted to estimate the causal effect as precise as we can at the low level, right? So we wanted to ideally estimate the causal exposure response curve, right? Now, again, this is an area where there is an enormous amount of literature how you estimate the causal exposure response curve, right? You can use parametric model, non-parametric model, spline, polynomial, whatever, right? But in this context, in the context of air pollution, and I bet in other contexts, what I found from the data is that the confounders and the amount of confounding varies when you're looking at low level of exposure versus high level of exposure. If you're thinking just a stupid, simple regression model, right? And you put like a spline on pollution, then you say, okay, well, you have confounders, right? So you adjust for age, gender, race, smoking, blah, 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 right? Well, when you do that, you're assuming that the confounders and the amount of confounding is the same regardless of where you are in the exposure response curve. Actually, just think about the US for a moment, right? And let me take this map. So let me just, now I'm going to take an hour to just go back. I'm sure there is a smarter way to do it, but whatever. So let me just go back. Sorry, maybe I can do this. Okay, here we go, right? So when I'm estimating the exposure response curve, when I am at the part of the United States, so let's say where is low level of pollution, and there are parts of the United States which is a high level of pollution, just try to picture this part, right, where we are, this part where we are. These are different worlds. And the confounders, what are the key variables that affect health and affect pollution here and here are really different. You can actually look at the data. You can look at the imbalance of the confounders on the different parts of the distribution. So what we did with Georgia, let's see if I can figure out a smarter way to do this. No, because I don't know. But what we did with Georgia was to develop a new statistical approach that will use the amount of the data to select the confounders. Okay, now I crashed the computer. That select the confounders and adjust for confounding bias differently at the different level of the exposure response. So actually, I'm very excited about this paper because I don't think, I mean, of course, I'm always very excited about the work I do with my students, but I thought that it was really interesting to try to identify and try to approach. So basically, from a causal inference perspective, I wanted to estimate this exposure response curve, and I'm thinking about a sequence of randomized experiments where I'm basically approximate a randomized experiment within this range, and then approximate a randomized experiment within this range, and so on. And then I can think about balance of the covariate, and then thinking about which the covariate that I want to balance and match among all of these ranges could be different, and then can be informed by the data, right? And then we also allow that the experiment configuration is unknown, right? So we are not actually fixing the cutoff. And without going too much detail, this is just a simulation study, but we simulate data where, so this is the true exposure response curve, and we simulate data so then the amount of confounding varies at different levels of the exposure response curve, so which are the confounder and the amount of confounding varies. And so you can see that the standard methods, because they will not have the flexibility, will tend to miss this lower part where we were able to capture. And that's, I mean, going back, that's the policy question, right? So what's happening here is exactly the policy question. Then the other challenges that has been happening at the APA is that the new administration is saying, okay, even if there is all of the evidence in the world, we are not going to allow regulation unless the data for these studies becomes publicly available and they can be reproduced by others. And and so that is called the EPA new transparency rule. And I think that in general, I'm all pro and in favor of reproducible research. And in certain way, my own team, we're very fortunate because we rely on data that is either publicly available or data that we buy from Medicare and Medicaid claims. So in principle, everyone can reproduce our own study. The problem with this rule is that there are a lot of epidemiological study that relies on cohort data or private data that cannot be possibly be made publicly available. And so by implementing this rule will prevent regulation from all of these studies. But all of this to say, though, that with respect to my own team, clearly the importance of open science and reproducible research is extremely important. And so even within this 480 million person year study, we are actually, and all of the studies that we are conducting, we are following all of the different elements for reproducible research and reproducible workflow, from the collected data and the documentation, the processing of the programs, all of the process data, the analysis code, and having the GitHub and so on. Now, going back to the policy question, one thing which I tell you, the importance of data science and policy, and honestly at this point, politics, has become really important. So I told you that actually the original paper that we published, it was March 22nd, was last week, where we explained to the world and try to what does it mean to infer causality from analysis of observational data, and why the argument moved forward from the oil industry consultant about manipulative causation was, not valid, pretty much. I have a better way, but maybe it's inappropriate to say yes. But that's what we tried to say. And it was this paper was open to the public and was open to many of the scientists and many of the policymakers. In fact, on March 29, what Science has reported is at the public conference yesterday, the 7-member Clean Air Act Scientific Advisory Committee, which is our all oil industry executive, agreed to recommend the EPA administrator to reconvene an auxiliary panel of experts that he fired last October, or name a new panel made up of members with similar know-how. Because even the other people of the panel realized that this idea of manipulative causation was pushed forward with someone with strong interest, and they didn't have the expertise. So I'm going to wrap it up by just saying a couple of more things, very simple things. One is, this is my team, which I'm superly happy and proud, and they do all the work. I pretty much just talk about things. And then also I wanted to thank you for your attention, and this is my dog, which is a special advisor for the Data Science Initiative and available for consultation to the co-director of the MIT Data Science Initiative. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions. Yes?
Your biggest question was like sort of validating, like trying to validate against manipulative causation in terms of like external confounding factors. How about maybe like internal confounding factors, for instance, the personal or implicit bias of research or the market?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's harder to correct. I mean, so what you're saying, I just want to make sure, you're saying that there are, by personal confounder factor, you mean the drive of the researcher to publish positive findings or trying to manipulate the data so then they show an effect when it's not there? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and even perhaps subconsciously.
Yes, I mean, I think that this is a field where it's definitely, it's a challenge, right? So how do we control that? I mean, I can't possibly control that. The way that the way that the community has handled that is by doing your independent reanalysis, right? So this was actually why they say, well, all the data should be made publicly available, right? Well, honestly, in the context of health data, that's never gonna happen, right? And the one reason why they wanted to do that was exactly for that reason, right? Let's have to reproduce the study. But what has been going on, which I think is very powerful, is to contract. So for example, the American Cancer Society study, which was one of the most landmark studies in air pollution and health, what they did, they contracted a group in Canada that took exactly the same data and they reanalyzed, right? Now, is some of this literature affected by publication bias? Probably yes. You know, I think that's true. But on the other hand, you know, we need to look at the whole body of evidence. The other thing that's happening right now, looking at health effects on low level, there have been 3 studies that have been funded simultaneously, one in the US, one in Canada, and one is in Europe. And then we analyze each other's data. But yes, I mean, you know, in general, when you're looking at observational data, a lot of correlated variable, you know, fishing for an answer, it's always a concern. Yeah.
2 questions. So one is in terms of actually measuring the effect of particulate matter below 2.5. Is there any correlation with the other pollutants, such as, for example, carbon monoxide or NOx?
Yeah.
And if so, how does it affect the overall implications in terms of regulating?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, so go ahead.
My second question is with regard to the health effects measurement. Is this granularity of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer is something which is desirable, or one needs to be a bit more granular in order to make more refined conclusions?
Yeah, excellent question. So for the first question, yes, all of these pollutants are highly correlated with each other. So from the policy question, what we have been doing, and again, that's another area where more work needs to be done, is what we have been trying to do is, you know, in that paper, we predict exposure to both PM2.5 and ozone, and we're also doing for the traffic pollutant. And then every time you estimate the effect of PM2.5, you try to control for the exposure to the other pollutants, right? It's never perfect. So for example, another area, when you're thinking about machine learning for exposure prediction, there is no work, I'm aware, of actually predicting these pollutants simultaneously and looking at a health effect of their pollution mixture, because you don't breed one pollutant at a time, you breed a soup, right? So there's, at some point, there was a lot of work about that, and I think still a lot of work needs to be done about it. The problem is, if you want to have an impact on human health, you're going to crash it against the law, because the law regulates one pollutant at a time. So they want to know whether PM2.5 below that level, it's harmful. They don't care whether or not the entire pollution mix make you sick, even if that would be a more realistic consideration, right? So there is the scientific goal and the policy goal, and I think we all know very well that we need to work in both areas. Now, in terms of the spatial resolution, it really depends, right? So with claims data, if you look at the health from claims data, they have their own strengths and limitations. The strengths is like there are covered million people. The limitation is the claims data, and the limitation are that I only know the place of residence up to a zip code. So if you give me smaller than 1 kilometer grid, well, there is nothing, I don't know how the person spends their time, right? However, there are other cohort data, they know exactly the residential address, right? So for this type of cohort data, if you know the residential address, and actually in some of this data, you know how they spend their day, well, be able to zoom in and be even more spatially resolute at less than 1 kilometer, that would be very valuable. Yes?
I'm Did you correct for smoking? You corrected for
Yes, well, you missed it because I went too fast. So in the whole big data, no, because claims data don't tell me whether or not someone smoked. So what we did is we have a subset of the people in Medicare. They are in they are basically they get every 2 years a phone call, and they ask whether or not they smoke. So we did a study only for the people where they were asked whether or not they were smoker, and when we control for smoking, the results didn't change at all. So we control for the smaller set, but we didn't control for the larger set because we didn't have the data.
My question is a little bit about the mechanism between air pollution and the health. So whether the accumulated exposure to air pollution or the maximum exposure to pollution impacts on health more. So that I think is very, very important because like you work in more focus on outdoor air pollution, but actually most people or many people spend most of their time indoors. So do you also consider the indoor air pollution, or like because you also maybe consider the duration of exposure to real air pollution?
So all great questions. So personally, I don't do any work on indoor air pollution, but there is enormous amount, a lot of people that do fantastic work on indoor air pollution, not all in the United States, but all around the country. There is enormous work and beautiful work in developing country where they are looking at indoor exposure, especially when they're using like cook stove and they're cooking indoor and so on. So I don't do any of that work. For policy reason, what we wanted to do is we want to look at whether the level of pollution, the ambient level of pollution, which is the one that are regulated by the EPA, make you sick. Because if you want to address the policy question, what I need to know is whether what is monitored outside and make you sick. Now, if you are at home and start cooking steak on your iron board, well, that's not EPA fault, right? So we can control that. Anyway, by the way, one thing I learned, there was a fascinating study. By the way, if you're curious, there is an article on the New Yorker that came up 2 days ago of a study of nothing to do. I was just commenting, and there was a beautiful study that accurately measure level of pollution indoor in the different homes in the United States. And they measured that the level of fine particulate matter on Thanksgiving Day is higher than the highest level of fine particulate matter in New Delhi. It reached 325 microgram per cubic meter. So Thanksgiving Day, just want you to know we're breathing a lot of fine particulate matter. So anyway, it's a fascinating study. It's a beautiful article in the New Yorker, but it talks about all of the sources of indoor pollution that we are getting. But that's not what I do. 1 and 2, yeah.
On pollutants.
On what?
To follow that question, I guess on pollutants, the different pollutants. If you had to make a list of the sources of all the various pollutants that leads to mortality, like what's the top 5 list of causes of mortality, the actual pollution sources?
Yeah. Power plants, coal-fired power plants, traffic. And then, other sources, but that becomes much lower. So the most important target is coal-fired power plants. Yeah. Which is also, if you knock down, and it's already happening because it's cost efficient, if you turn, which by the way, they are the same sources of greenhouse gases emission. So that's why it becomes a circle in its political controversy, because actually if you knock down the most important sources of fine particulate matter, you're also knocking down the most important sources of greenhouse gases, which, in another area, that would actually be good news, because you can basically solve two of the most important environmental problem in the world right now just by targeting. But happen to be that these are also very politically controlled. Let's see, there was a question there.
Yeah,
If you could talk a little more about the unobserved confounders in those, especially large-scale studies.
Yeah.
Sort of like researchers, of course, try their best to control for all the observed factors. But like people can just come up with other factors such like genetic differences, which basically there's no way to measure it right now. Like there are like statistical approaches such as instrument variables, like you use twin studies, like try to resolve this unobserved confounders a little bit, but like those methods just require many more assumptions, and I imagine this could not be applied to the whole Medicare cohort things. Like, do you worry about the unobserved factors? Like,
Yeah, of course.
how do you think about like those IV or more refined approaches in those large-scale studies?
Yeah, no, I mean, so first of all, with this type of data, we can come up with any method you want. We're never gonna be sure, we're never gonna rule out unobserved confounding bias, right? We'll never. I mean, that's always gonna be a threat to the validity to these studies. And so that's true. Now, we are working on actually taking the best of, it's out there from, the Paul Rosenbaum approach of sensitivity analysis or measure confounding bias, just to get a sense of if something exists, how big it has to be, right, to really invalidate the results. So we're trying to do that, but it's hard because these are really messy data. Now, there is a whole another body of literature, which I've been working on a little bit, into using what we call instrumental variable or quasi-randomization to try to look at the health effects of pollution. And we know that when you have that opportunity, right, that allow you to kind of address for a measure confounding bias. Actually, there have been some studies. There was a beautiful study, actually, I was involved on the Presidio National Academy of Science by Michael Greenstone. And Michael Greenstone did a really clever study in China where they have the UI River in China, and they have a coal ban. I'm sorry, not a cold ban. Let me take it back. I'm thinking about differences. So there was the UI River in China, and they have a new policy where if you live north of the river, I think it's right, if you live north of the river, you will have a free eating, and if you live south of the river, you will not have free eating. And so what happened is, just by having the river, there was an area, two areas, there was a regression discontinuity design, actually. Just across the river, people were breathing more pollution than below the river, but they were all similar to each other, right? And there was a strong effect. Now, there have been a lot of instrumental variable study, like coal ban. So in Ireland, they banned the coal, and so you have a drastic change in pollution level and nothing else changed. So there have been other points of evidence about this. But with these data, now, when you're talking about genetics, you have to think that in order something to confound, has to be correlated with our pollution level, right? So you always have to, and also has to be correlated with our pollution level, and has to be totally uncorrelated with everything else you have been adjusting for, right? So, I mean, there can always be the one day is going to come up the famous measure confounder that will tell you that breathing pollution is good for you, but we haven't found it yet. Yes, hi. Yes, okay.
So you talked a lot about the sort of propagating the uncertainty in concentrations as estimated into the health effects. I was wondering if you've thought, sort of done the analysis where you think about what kinds of improvements in understanding of concentrations in particular places would most help the health effects estimation, and sort of where and when those would be, if you have any insights of what would be the priorities for concentration understanding.
It's a great question, but I'm trying to understand better what you're saying. So you're saying, yeah.
What would you tell the atmospheric chemists to better understand based on your ability to actually calculate the more policy relevant health impacts?
So I think that it's a great problem. So I think, okay, great question. So I think the better we estimate the level of pollution in the area where the pollution is low, and to understand what are the main driver of this pollution level in the low area, especially in the area that are below the national ambient air quality standard, more impact we have in policy. And the other thing is the degree that we understand from atmospheric chemistry what are the major drivers, back to making sure that we're not missing any important confounders, better it is, right? So I think going back to your question is, how can we make sure the estimates of pollution level at low level are good? Because that's where we're mostly interested. And what are the major driver of this pollution level at low level that could be mostly correlated with health that we need to control for it, just to make sure that we are not missing, you know, the important measure confounder. Is that where? Yeah. We should do that together. Okay, one more, last question. Okay.
Going back to an earlier point, if you're, you look at what OMB has dictated, that you shouldn't take into account any positive effects like the greenhouse gas reduction in addition, then of course there are two problems with that. One is you don't get a full feeling of the benefits of lowering the pollution. But the second is you discourage research that anybody might want to do on those so-called secondary effects, which could be, of course, much larger than the effects you're looking at.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, I think the EPA risk assessment account for what's called the co-benefit. So they try to evaluate that. But the current administration is trying to destroy that. So, well, thank you so much for your attention and all your great questions.